to help meet those needs. Chair Durbin asked me to preside at today's hearing, and I'm grateful for the honor of doing so. On Chair Durbin's behalf, I also want to thank Ranking Member Graham and his staff for working on a bipartisan basis to put together today's consensus witness panel, and I look forward to some opening remarks by Senator Tillis, Senator Blumenthal, and we will be joined, I understand, by Chair Durbin later in this hearing. It has been more than 15 years since the Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing on the civil justice gap. The reality that we really have two justice systems in this country, one for those who have the resources to hire counsel and one for those who don't, has only become more stark in those 15 years. Three quarters of low-income American households experience at least one civil legal problem per year. Only a fraction seek legal help and get it because of the high cost of legal services. That means that vast swaths of legal issues low-income Americans face month in and month out go unaddressed. Landlord-tenant, debt collection, public benefits, domestic violence, consumer rights. The list is long. To be clear, these aren't meritless cases. When you give these folks lawyers, when they are able to secure representation, they're nearly 7 times more likely to win their cases than when they're unrepresented. To make matters worse, Congress for decades has failed to adequately fund the Legal Services Corporation, the largest single funder of civil legal aid in the United States. As we mark LSC's 50th anniversary this year, Congress is funding the organization at about half the inflation-adjusted dollars it appropriated in the 1980s. There's been progress. In my home state of Delaware, you knew I was going to have to focus something positive on Delaware. Our 3 largest civil legal aid organizations have partnered to raise funds and provide legal services to the Delawareans who most need them. In 2023, our state took a major step. Our legislature passed a law that guaranteed a right to representation to low-income Delawareans in landlord-tenant matters and appropriated new funds to make that right a reality. Legal Services Corporation of Delaware and Delaware Community Legal Aid have been able to staff up, hiring new lawyers to take on these cases, and they've helped more low-income Delawareans stay in their homes and to settle or resolve landlord-tenant disputes promptly. That's better for the clients, for the families, their communities, I would argue for landlords, and for our whole state. Delaware did something else I want to highlight. With sign-off from our Supreme Court, the state created a qualified tenant advocate program to help handle the influx of cases. These advocates are not members of the Delaware Bar. They undergo a rigorous training program to handle the basics of landlord-tenant cases and often come from the communities they serve. As someone who did identical work as a law student, I understand how it is possible for folks who are not members of the bar to be very effective and engaged advocates in such cases. That program in Delaware has been a big success, and it shows with some out-of-the-box thinking, states and legal aid agencies can help more people with more issues, even when attorneys are in short supply. Finally, I want to highlight how the issues of this hearing relate to another problem I am concerned about addressing and for which we have bipartisan legislation. The practice in many states to suspend driver's licenses for folks when they are too poor to pay court-related fines or fees. Not only do we not adequately help people meet their civil legal needs, we then further keep them down by taking away their ability to get to work and earn the money needed to pay off fines and meet those needs for their families. This creates a vicious downward cycle. I'm proud to lead the Driving for Opportunity Act with Republican Senator Roger Wicker that encourages states to stop this counterproductive practice. It has many bipartisan co-sponsors, including Senators Blumenthal and Tillis, Durbin, Grassley, Blumenthal, and Booker. Law enforcement organizations endorse it because they don't want police officers acting as collections agents. Civil rights advocates endorse it because they want to see us stop these so-called debt traps. I'm proud Delaware has also recently passed model legislation to address this and other issues in the fines and fees space. In short, both of these examples give me hope we can come together to address the issues we will hear about today from our talented panel. I will now turn to Senator Tillis for his opening remarks, and then I will invite Senators Chair Durbin, if he wishes to make an opening remark, and Senator Blumenthal as well. Senator Tillis?
Thank you, Senator Coons. I obviously didn't come prepared for a formal opening statement, but I wanted to say 3 things. Number one, it's great to see the chair back and on his feet, and I wish you a speedy recovery. Number 2, happy birthday to the ranking member in absentia. And then number 3, I grew up in a trailer park, and a lot of the cases that that we'll probably hear today resonate with me. What doesn't resonate with me, though, are what we need is access to the civil system. In that trailer park, I remember people getting evicted, and they had a legitimate reason why they couldn't pay the bills. Now, fast forward a few years. At 17, I got my real estate license. At 18, I was able to practice. Then I started doing real estate management. And I saw the other side of the equation where people were absolutely taking advantage of the system and taking advantage of landlords. So how do we strike a balance? How do we make sure that legal representation is available to everyone across the ideological spectrum, for example? How do we make sure that we protect landlords who are legitimately following the law and are being abused by lawsuits? I've talked to a number of people, like the people that I worked for when I was 18, 19 years old with a real estate license, doing real estate management. How are we protecting the ones that are that are on the margins, and they're a lawsuit away from losing something that is their livelihood as landlords? We've spent so much time in this building demonizing landlords, and we talk about they're all owned by hedge funds, or they're all owned by venture capitalists, and they're all corporate entities taking advantage of the renters. I think that we need to have some balance in this policy if we don't want it to be a political lightning rod from Congress to Congress. How do we start demonstrating that we are helping the marginalized people, like the people I lived with in that trailer park, 2 trailer parks, one in Jacksonville, Florida, and one in Nashville, Tennessee, that I found out that actually Jelly Roll lived in too. At a finance hearing. This place is wonderful. You learn things you'd never otherwise know. But let's come up with policy that strikes a balance. For the people who are in this room who genuinely want everyone to have access to legal representation, regardless of what their ideological leanings may be, because this is not just about renters, this is across the board. We can come up with balanced policy, or we can have a hearing like this. I say this ad nauseum here. We can have a hearing like this every 2 years, not making progress, and we'll just see which ideology wins, given who's in power in Congress and who's in the White House. So let's get right, let's get smart, but recognize this isn't, not everyone who lived in that trailer park were victims. Some of those people were victimizing their landlords. So how do we strike that balance? And that's what I would leave you with without having thought about an opening statement until about 6 minutes ago.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. You are, as ever, eloquent. And anyone who has represented folks for a long period of time knows there's 2 sides to every story, and our challenge here legislatively is to find balance. Senator Blumenthal had indicated an interest in making a brief opening statement, but Chairman Durbin is with us. Chairman, I'll join Senator Tillis in wishing for your rapid and full recovery, and we're blessed to have you with us.
I'm yielding to the chairman, not only because of his seniority, but also because of his strength and courage in coming here after recent surgery, and I know well what it's like to try to get around this place with a cane.
Well, let me thank my colleagues for those kind words, and let me tell you that having had a knee replaced last October and a hip replaced 10 days ago, I'm getting out of the parts department, and I'm going to try to deal with what's left in a very fulsome way. But navigating is difficult, and Senator Coons, that's why we asked you to preside over this hearing so there wouldn't be any delay in its start. I know that you and Senator Graham and others will handle well. I think Senator Tillis, I think you put your finger on it. What you're asking for is justice. Be fair to the landlord, be fair to the tenant, but make sure that they both have the power to articulate their positions effectively in our system of laws. My practice of law, going back a number of years now, there were many people who it just wasn't small claims court. The decision being made in that court would literally change their lives, whether it meant eviction or a future home for their families and the future economic opportunities that's created by it. The simple fact of the matter is, for the poor people of America, we don't provide enough resources for them to have adequate counsel when they need it over and over again. I want to thank my good close friend. I don't see him here today. He's usually here, John Levy. There he is, front row. John, thank you for being here. He has been such a strong and consistent voice when it comes to legal services, and I want to thank him for all he's brought, and I'll put my statement in the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair Durbin, and thank you for your leadership on access to justice issues for decades. Senator Blumenthal, did you want to make a brief opening statement before we get? Would you also like to make a statement, Senator? Senator Blumenthal.
Very briefly, just to thank, first of all the witnesses for being here today on this very important topic. As a prosecutor, United States Attorney for Connecticut, and then as State Attorney General for 20 years, my nightmare was always the pro se defendant. Somebody in court without a lawyer, unguided missile, no justice. And it was a nightmare for the judge as well, because the representation, skilled, thoughtful, energetic, vigorous, is the way this system works. To be in favor of representation by a professional advocate is not to take sides, either for the landlord or against the landlord, for the big corporation or against the big corporation. It is basically to make the system work, much like saying we need 4 wheels on a car. An advocate in court is essential to someone receiving justice, both sides. I was particularly struck by a statistic in the testimony from Mr. Flagg, that 80 to 97% of domestic violence victims are unrepresented. That's shameful in our country. 80 to 97% of domestic violence victims are unrepresented. They're women, by and large, and they can't get protective orders, which are vital to their health and safety, as well as food and other forms of support, which affects not only them, but their children. The justice gap in this country is real. It's been aggravated by the pandemic, and we have an obligation to solve it, and it should be done on a bipartisan basis. You know, I can remember efforts when Richard Nixon was president to abolish the Legal Services Corporation. And eventually, the White House and the president decided that, yes, it made sense on a bipartisan basis to keep the Legal Services Corporation, even if they were going to abolish what was then known as the anti-poverty program. So I hope we can come together to provide access to justice in the United States. It is one of the defining features of our democracy, and some might argue one of the most precious. So thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your commitment to justice and the rule of law.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. I'll now proceed to introduce our witness panel and defer to my friend and colleague from Texas to introduce the Chief Justice. Our first witness will be Ronald Flagg, who served as the president of the Legal Services Corporation since 2020. Prior to joining LSC as general counsel a decade ago, Mr. Flagg practiced at the law firm Sidley & Austin for 31 years, where he chaired the firm's Committee on Pro Bono and Public Interest Law. I now defer to my colleague, who is a former member of the Texas Supreme Court.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce to the committee my friend of long standing, Nathan Hecht, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Texas, with whom I had the honor of serving for a period of 7 years on that court. And I think I was thinking back when we first ran into each other, I think it was 1988. Chief Justice Hecht has had a distinguished career as a district judge and also obviously on the Texas Supreme Court, where he has been elected 7 times. We elect judges in Texas, as you know, and he's been elected 7 times, first in 1988 and then in 2014 and 2020 as Chief Justice. I know he shares my concerns about access to justice because we've talked about that topic many different times. I'm interested in hearing him talk a little bit about the Texas experience and how we extracted politics from access to justice and basically just preserve the bipartisan support that now enjoys. But it's my great pleasure to introduce to the committee my good friend, Nathan Hecht.
Thank you, Senator. And again, we greatly appreciated the cooperation on having a strong and bipartisan witness panel today. Our next witness is Nicole Nelson. Ms. Nelson is the founding CEO of Frontline Justice, an organization that seeks to find innovative solutions to addressing the civil justice gap by training justice workers to help meet civil justice needs in their communities. Prior to joining Frontline Justice, Ms. Nelson was executive director of the Alaska Legal Services Corporation, Alaska's only statewide provider of free civil aid. Our final witness is Ms. Veronica Gonzalez, who worked with Legal Aid of Chicago to escape an abusive relationship and was represented in her domestic violence, custody, and child support matters by that organization. Ms. Gonzalez has since obtained her associate's degree and now serves as a board member of Legal Aid Chicago. To all four of our witnesses, thank you for being with us today. So briefly, after I swear in the witnesses, each of you will have 5 minutes in order to provide your opening statement. We'll proceed to questioning. Each senator will have 5 minutes. We can do a second round if there is interest or additional issues. So would all four witnesses please stand to be sworn in? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before our committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you very much. Mr. Flagg, you may proceed with your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Coons, Chairman Durbin, members of the committee. I'm Ron Flagg, President of the Legal Services Corporation, and I'm honored to speak to you today. I'd like to thank you and the committee staff for gathering this group together and doing it in bipartisan fashion. Natural disasters, the opioid epidemic, domestic violence are equal employers. They fall on all of us. They fall across ideological spectrum, and we must respond to those threats and to the access to justice crisis in a bipartisan fashion as you've gathered here today. The Constitution provides a right to a lawyer when someone is accused of a crime, but there's no constitutional right to an attorney when someone faces life-altering civil legal problems such as the loss of a home, abuse from a domestic partner, or the devastating effects of a natural disaster. Our legal system has largely been designed by lawyers for lawyers, and when someone is forced to muddle through themselves, they are at a distinct disadvantage. To help address this imbalance, Congress created LSC 50 years ago. As the Chairman described, we are the largest single funder of civil legal aid. We distribute 94% of our funding, our federal appropriation, to 130 independent legal aid providers operating more than 900 offices in every state, county, the District of Columbia, and the territories. Nearly 50 million Americans are eligible for LSC-funded legal services, including more than 15 million children and over 7.5 million senior citizens. In 2022, LSC released our fourth Justice Gap Report. The chair alluded to several of our findings. They were all quite sobering. Nearly 3/4 of low-income households have experienced at least one civil legal problem in the past year, and many households are now experiencing multiple problems. Even more stunning is when confronted with these life-altering issues, low-income Americans receive no or inadequate assistance for 92%. That's 92% of their significant civil legal needs. Given these figures, it is no surprise that only 28% of low-income Americans believe that our civil legal system treats them fairly. Indeed, we're not even close to meeting the needs of your constituents. More than 3.6 million people seek legal assistance from LSC grantees annually. However, due to limited resources, half of those eligible applicants have to be turned away. And that includes more than 1 million children, over 1 million households facing eviction, 140,000 veterans, and 550,000 survivors of domestic violence. And these numbers actually understate the problem because they do not include those who do not seek legal aid because they do not realize they're facing a legal problem or are unaware of the existence of legal aid, or those who earn just a little bit more than our eligibility guidelines, which are very strict. While a justice gap is daunting, we do know how to address it. We need, first of all, more resources. Research consistently demonstrates that low-income people who receive legal help overwhelmingly achieve better outcomes than those without access to such assistance. For example, in eviction cases, generally 90% of those who are unrepresented suffer an unfavorable result, and the flip side is 90% of tenants who are represented achieve a favorable outcome. So it makes a difference. While I am aware that this is not the Appropriations Committee, I must note the link between LSC's chronic underfunding and the growing justice gap. In FY 1994, Congress appropriated $400 million to LSC. 3 decades later, LSC's appropriation has only inched up to $560 million, as was described, not nearly enough to keep up with inflations, recessions, the pandemic, and increases in the poverty population. If our appropriation of in FY 1980 of $300 million had simply been adjusted to inflation, our appropriation today would be over $1 billion. And research shows that for every dollar invested in civil legal aid, $3 to $13 is realized in return. We need to do other things in addition to expending more resources. We need to take advantage of technology such as AI, pro bono. I want to talk about something that the other witnesses will also touch on. We must overhaul how we deliver legal services. The civil dispute resolution system was built on the premise that the user of the system will be represented by lawyers. That assumption is too frequently false, and we must expand the universe of people who can lawfully render assistance. The chair mentioned the Delaware Tenant Advocacy Program. That's a great example. Alaska has seen the use of community justice workers, and that has proven to be a very effective approach, and Ms. Nelson will tell you more about that today. In conclusion, closing the justice gap will require political will, commitment, and innovation. The status quo is unsustainable. As the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia stated 10 years ago at LSC's 40th anniversary, and I quote, "Can there be justice if it is not equal? Can there be a just society when some do not have justice? Equality, equal treatment is perhaps the most fundamental element of justice." Mr. Chair, members of the committee, we are not meeting this standard. We can do better. We must do better. The path forward requires a concerted effort from all of us to ensure that the ideals of justice for all become a lived reality for every American. Thank you for inviting me here today. I look forward to discussing how we can improve the access to justice in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flagg. Mr. Chief Justice.
Chairman Coons, Chairman Nathan Heck, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Texas for 10 years and a member of the court since 1989, serving for several years alongside then Justice, now Senator John Cornyn, my good friend. And I will just stop and say that over the years, access to justice issues have not gotten a more favorable reception from anyone in the Congress than John Cornyn. And we have knocked on his door many, many times. I think every time he sees me coming, he kind of wonders what's next for access to justice. So we have a long history. I'm the longest serving member of the court in Texas history, and I belong to the National Conference of Chief Justices, the 58 highest ranking judges in the country, and was CCJ president from late 2019 to mid-2021 during the beginning of COVID. Thank you for inviting me to appear before you today. In my brief time, I'll just say 3 things. First, the justice gap, which is a chasm, really, is indisputable. People's needs for basic civil legal services greatly exceed their availability because of cost. The poor and people of limited means cannot afford lawyers, and so they are denied justice, pure and simple. And it pains me to sit here after 43 years of judicial service and say before the United States Senate Committee on the Judiciary, well into the 21st century with advancements at every turn, that the greatest system of justice, not just on the earth, but in the history of the earth, is welshing on the promise of justice for all. The justice gap gets little public attention, but everyone should know that it exists and must be addressed. Second, the justice gap hurts us all. It hurts the millions of people legal services providers must turn away for want of resources, or who think help is impossible, or who don't even know they need help. It burdens the courts, which do not and cannot function well when most parties in 18 million civil cases a year in state courts don't have lawyers. And apropos what Senator Blumenthal was reminiscing about earlier, when I was a trial judge, if I got one pro se party in the courtroom a month, I thought Providence was visiting justice on me for something I had done. But now, in domestic relations cases, eviction cases, debt collection cases, most parties don't have lawyers. And so it greatly impacts the efficiency of the judiciary. It burdens the legal profession, whose noble tradition it is to represent parties pro bono, even though grocers are not expected to feed the poor for free, or builders to house them for free, or even doctors to treat them for free, though many do. Lawyers still stand to the challenge of pro bono representation. The justice gap burdens society, the economy, business, taxpayers, who must pick up the costs of people's inability to make do because of unmet civil legal needs, as study after study has confirmed. And perhaps worst of all, the justice gap hurts the integrity of the justice system, keeping it from performing as Americans are entitled to expect. And third, I will say, to bridge the justice gap, much is being done, but much more is desperately needed. Identifying specific groups that need help, like veterans and sexual assault survivors, which Texas and many other states have done, benefits them, but it also puts a face on the broader need and takes away the abstraction of access to justice. It focuses on a person. Innovation is critical, such as by enlisting computer technology to train legal providers, especially in remote locations, that Texas has a good many, and counsel clients in groups. AI can facilitate client communications, analyze problems, propose solutions, and who knows what else. We learn something about AI every day. Paraprofessionals and community justice workers can be licensed to perform limited legal services, as Texas and many other states are doing. Legal aid lawyers can be recruited by offering special training in the law schools and licensing requirements so as to target a legal aid practice rather than just the general practice of law. And as always, much more funding is needed, federal and state, not just in emergencies like pandemics and storms, although certainly in those situations, but day to day and to build for the future. Bridging the justice gap must be a bipartisan effort. It has been for the Texas legislature, of which I am personally proud, and I'll say more about that if I have time. For the business community, like Exxon and AT&T in Texas, who are longtime steady supporters of LSC and access to justice efforts. For DOJ's Office of Access to Justice, headed by Director Rachel Rossi. For the Legal Services Corporation, the leader in providing legal services throughout the country for 50 years. And for the Conference of Chief Justices, my colleagues who have long supported access to justice. Working together, we can narrow the justice gap. Thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. Ms. Nelson.
Thank you, Senator Coons.
Microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Thank you, Chairman Coons and Senator Durbin and Judiciary Committee for having me here today. My name is Nicole Nelson, and I'm the founding CEO of Frontline Justice, a new nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing our nation's sprawling access to justice crisis by empowering a new category of legal helper, the community justice worker across the nation. Prior to taking this role, I spent the last 25 years straight out of law school as a legal aid attorney in my home state of Alaska and as the executive director of Alaska Legal Services. And I agreed to lead this new initiative because I could stay in Alaska, and also because based on my 25 years in the field, this is the only scalable solution to the access to justice crisis I have seen. So I'm a true believer. And before I talk about the justice innovation that is catching fire across the nation in places as diverse as Texas and Delaware and Arizona and Utah, I want to talk briefly about the size and the scope of the problem. Now, my colleagues have mentioned that the numbers are very daunting. Across the nation, 150 million to 250 million new civil legal problems people face each year. And again, a stunning 92% of those go unmet. These are extraordinary numbers. And these have huge consequences for communities and families. Family breadwinners lose their jobs, children can't go to school, elders can't get medical treatment, family homes are foreclosed upon, and children are taken into the child protection system instead of staying with relatives or in their communities. And this lack of access undermines faith in our judicial institutions and our democracy. So while there is enormous cause for concern with respect to the affordability and accessibility of our current civil justice system, there's also much room for hope. And that hope lies in looking squarely at the evidence and committing to a future that accounts for it. So why is this happening? Why can't people get the help when they need it? There are a few reasons. And one of the first of those is historically, in thinking about this problem, we've restricted the practice of law to lawyers only. And the problem with this is that lawyers simply don't scale. And what do I mean by that? They're just too expensive for most people to afford, and then there are huge swaths of our nation, most of Alaska, where there are no lawyers. These are legal deserts. And so, again, what about funding for legal aid or more pro bono? Why isn't that the answer? Well, of course, those are necessary things, and there's a role to play for legal aid and pro bono, but legal aid is vastly underfunded, so much so that again, legal aid is forced to turn away one person for everyone they represent, not because the cases lack merit and not because there aren't serious consequences at stake. They're turned away for lack of resources. And those who have dedicated their lives to doing this work are turned into gatekeepers who have to ration justice. And this hurts those who are denied services, it hurts those who have to do the rationing, and it hurts our institutions. We have to decide which of our neighbors deserve help when they all deserve it. And that's not even the half of it. President Flagg mentioned before that most people who have legal problems, civil legal problems, don't know that there's a legal solution to their problems, and so they don't identify it as such. They see these as life problems, and so they're not going to seek out lawyers or go to courts to try to solve those. And the thing of it is, it doesn't really have to be this way. Better justice is possible. If we accept these facts, it becomes clear that while legal aid and lawyers and pro bono have a critical role to play, lawyer-only court-based solutions quite simply are not going to cut it. And we cannot do this alone. We can start to imagine other possibilities. And this is where community and frontline justice workers come in. Have you ever been helped by a community health aide or seen a first responder, like a paramedic or an EMT in action? Can you imagine our healthcare system without them? This is what a community or frontline justice workers aim to be, the justice equivalent of these crucial actors in our healthcare system. And who are they? They're ordinary people in a wide range of trusted roles within their community. They could be health aides, tribal administrators, social workers, teachers, clergy, or librarians who've been trained and supported by legal aid organizations to provide some simple legal help on issues that would otherwise go unmet. They are the people that people go to with their life problems. So if you might think about it like a type of legal CPR or first aid. Really importantly, is the fact that such justice workers are often drawn from the very communities that they are serving, which means they are closest to the problems and come with the local knowledge that is so hard to come by but is essential to achieving real justice. In Alaska, we developed a justice worker program that both fits our community's needs and leverages our community's strength. We chose this route because we saw strong evidence that it would be effective and sustainable and could scale up to meet the needs of our state's people. Experience and solid empirical research show the safety, effectiveness, and positive impact of justice workers. To date, Alaska has recruited nearly 500 community justice workers who are recruited and have been recruited. They're either fully trained or in the process of training, and they are supervised by Alaska Legal Services, the legal aid organization. They're in 47 different communities, most of which are off the road system, and are much more reflective of the client communities they serve than legal aid staff. They are addressing simple legal problems that left unaddressed would have devastating consequences. This model is exportable with LSC funding. We were LSC grantees in 5 states, Montana, New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma, and Minnesota, are using the model to help with legal issues in disaster recovery. The community justice worker is a model that can revolutionize access to justice in the U.S., and it was created by a legal services grantee using LSC funding. Frontline Justice was founded to help supercharge this growing movement and to clear regulatory space needed for the community justice worker model to exist across our nation, and to help build the supportive infrastructure that will help justice workers grow and thrive. I believe that community justice workers are the better justice we are looking for. It is the gold standard, and everybody in our country should have access to right-sized, on-demand, effective legal help from a trusted community source when they need it. And we should not be afraid of trying something new. I dream of a day when justice not only flows like a river, but also permeates the atmosphere like the air that we breathe, universally and equally available to all. And we believe that such universal access is within reach in the next decade if justice workers are fully empowered. Our nation and our communities deserve this better justice. I want to thank also my Senators Murkowski and Senator Sullivan for helping to support this work.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. Thank you for your dedicated and innovative work in this field. Ms. Gonzalez, thank you so much for joining us today to testify. We look forward to your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Senator Coons, and Ranking Member Graham for the opportunity to be here and share about my experience with civil legal aid and how legal representation impacted my life and the lives of my children. My name is Veronica Gonzalez, and I serve on the governing board of Legal Aid Chicago, the LSA-funded organization for Cook County, Illinois. I have been a board member for 5 years. Prior to becoming a board member, I was a client of Legal Aid Chicago. I am originally from Chicago, but at age 16, I dropped out of high school and moved to Washington State with my boyfriend and his family. I didn't want to go, but felt pressured. My son was born there when I was 18, and I was isolated from my family. My boyfriend was physically abusive and threatened to take my son if I left. I attempted to escape multiple times, once reaching my uncle's home in Minnesota. But he always convinced me to return, promising to change. I hoped he would keep his word, but the abuse continued. He physically abused me in front of my son, punching me, ripping out my hair, and leaving me with a bald spot the size of a quarter. He controlled my movements, took my wages from working from Chuck E. Cheese. His parents also abused me, limiting where I could go and when I could leave the house. His mother once dragged me back inside their home as I tried to call the police while being beaten. She witnessed her son kick me, hit me, and pull me by my hair and never helped. In 2016, when my son was 3, I took him for a medical checkup. I saw this as my chance to seek help away from my boyfriend and his family. I told the pediatrician and the nurse about the abuse, showed them my scalp, my bruises, and my lips swollen from the punches. They photographed my injuries and helped me make a safety plan. I told my boyfriend that the doctor needed to see my son 2 days later for another test. Once again, he refused to let me go alone. But the doctors asked him to remain in the waiting room. The clinic staff helped me and my son escape through the back door. We hid in the trunk of an employee's car and rode for 5 miles until we were safe because my son's father tried to block the parking lot exit. We were dropped off at a domestic violence shelter, which then helped us return to Illinois and my family. We left with nothing but the clothes on our backs. I was scared, even though he was miles away, because he knew where my family lived. I went to court in Chicago the next day to get an order of protection. The law student helped me get the emergency order, but I needed an attorney for my complicated case. I had no money to hire an attorney, and my family could not afford to pay for one. I had a hard time finding an attorney because of my complicity of my case, but then I found Legal Aid Chicago. My son's father hired attorneys in Washington State and Chicago to dismiss the order of protection and file for custody, asking for my son to be returned to Washington. My attorneys at Legal Aid Chicago contacted the Northwest Justice Project, which is the LSC-funded organization in Washington. They represented me for the court case in Washington, though I had fled Washington to Illinois because of the physical abuse. The two courts had to decide which state would have jurisdiction over my case and where my son should live, and which parent should have custody of him. There was a hearing where the judges heard about the abuse and why I fled. The two courts had to decide which state would have jurisdiction over my case and where my son should live. Thanks to my attorney's coordination, the judges ruled that my case should continue in Chicago. Legal Aid Chicago represented me, and the court gave me 2 years of order of protection and sole custody of my son. The court ordered his father to pay child support and get services to address his violence. Though I was living with my parents and younger siblings while all this was happening, I was still afraid. When they left the house, I would cry alone in the corner of the living room, reliving the abuse and fearing what would happen if I had to return to Washington, where I had no support and where he could easily continue to abuse me. My life is now very different. I have a new partner, and my son is now a big brother. I returned to school and completed my associate degree. At the Legal Aid Chicago board meeting earlier this year, the entire board cheered when they learned that I got my degree. When considering what was next, I decided to go to cosmetology school because people often feel safe when getting their hairs or nails done and will confide in their stylist about abuse. I am currently a full-time student on track to graduate next spring. I plan to use my training to help others find safety and direct them to legal services. Supporting civil legal aid is important to me, which is why I joined the board at Legal Aid Chicago. Many women in Chicago and across the country need legal help to end domestic violence, but cannot afford private attorneys. My legal case was complicated and I was in danger. I am very fortunate that I was able to be represented by Legal Aid Chicago and the Northwest Justice Project. Thank you for inviting me to share my story to increase the numbers of survivors who can be helped by civil legal aid.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gonzalez, both for your testimony and for your courage, and for staying engaged and taking not just the pain of your own experience and saying thank you to legal aid and moving on, but to being active and engaged in helping others find their route to address their challenges and their moments. So thank you for your courage and for your continued service, and to all 4 of our witnesses today for your decades of work in trying to address the civil justice gap. Chairman Durbin, would you like to question first?
Thank you very much. Justice Hecht, let me say that I have served many years with your friend and my friend, John Cornyn. He credits you with 36 years of friendship, and I certainly appreciated your testimony. In those rare, glorious moments when he agrees with me, I'm going to credit you, your friendship and inspiration for leading to that. So thank you for being here today. Ms. Nelson, these justice workers that you created in Alaska, apparently you had some help with state law in terms of those who might be prosecuted for practicing without a license and training the next class to step up. Can you give us any thoughts as to how other states ought to look at that? Turn on your microphone, please.
Sorry about that. Thank you for the question, Senator Durbin. So the Alaska Community Justice Worker model, so there are 2 things that are helpful that make it possible. One is that already Alaska has a very permissive, unauthorized practice of law statute. So across the nation, there are unauthorized practice of law statutes in every state, and they're uneven across the nation. Alaska's is very permissive. It essentially says that you shouldn't hold yourself out to be an attorney when you're not one and charge for services. So it prevents fraud, and then also says don't show up in court. So we had that going for us when we first started our program. And so we were able to develop training programs with assistance from from our partners at the tribally operated healthcare center, who were very they had already developed training programs for training healthcare workers, and so we were able to partner with them to develop training programs that would train our justice workers. And they were able to do that without violating the unauthorized practice of law prohibitions. However, if we wanted our justice workers to appear in court, which we do, we needed to get a waiver from the Alaska Supreme Court. And we were able to get that waiver in place. Alaska's Supreme Court passed that waiver at the tail end of 2022 with unanimous support from the Alaska Bar Association's Board of Governors and with support from our Supreme Court as well. And I think that the key to garnering that support from stakeholders across the board were a couple of things. When we set out to address our access to justice challenge, again, we looked at the facts and we understood that we could not solve the crisis that our community was facing with lawyer-only solutions. And so we took steps to include those who weren't lawyers in the process of addressing our access to justice challenges. And we were able to get buy-in from community members and understanding how the access to justice crisis was impacting people outside the legal system. With that information, yes.
I just thank you very much. I want to explore this because I think it's a great model and one that we ought to emulate in many situations, I hope even in my home state. Thank you very much for your testimony. Ms. Gonzalez, thank you. If you ever think you've had a bad day on this side of the table, listening to your story is an indication some of the battles that are being fought every single day by people with the courage like your own to protect yourself, your own dignity, but more importantly, your son, and to go to the lengths that most of us would find unimaginable. There you are in the trunk of a car with your son for 5 miles, hoping to escape and finally get a chance to have a decent life. That's what's at stake here. It isn't just a matter of who wins a lawsuit. It's a question of a person's life moving forward, your situation. Do I understand from your testimony that your son is now a big brother?
Yes, he is.
And you live in Chicago, nearby?
Yes, I do.
Well, good. I'm so glad that you're part of legal aid because your voice is very important to bring the reality of the experience of representing people with challenges like your own. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin. Senator Cornyn.
Chief Justice Hecht, I remember when you were a district judge in Dallas, I was a district judge in San Antonio. Chief Justice Berger gave a famous talk talking about access to justice more broadly and noted appropriately that the cost associated with getting disputes resolved in court and the time it took to get those disputes resolved were an impediment to access to justice. And so what grew out of that, as I recall, was the alternative dispute resolution movement as a way to expedite access to justice that through non-traditional means. Do you believe that that continues to play an important role in terms of access to justice more broadly?
Yes, I do, Senator. And we're experimenting with all kinds of ways of using that over the years. Some has been online. I mentioned AI as a possibility for bringing people together, hearing both sides and trying to get a resolution quickly, maybe online. But we've had mediation since you and I were, we didn't even know about it when you and I were district judges. But now we have mediation and all sorts of ways because the adversarial system, which is good, it's a good way to get to the truth when people can oppose each other and you can listen to them and try to decide. But it's not good when the people are not equally matched when they don't have equal access to the evidence, and so it continues to be developed.
And is the model that Ms. Nelson talked about in Alaska, is that something that you're exploring, or is maybe you've already gone farther than just exploring it in our state?
Yeah, we call them paraprofessionals, and the Texas Supreme Court just approved them after studying them for several months to make sure there weren't going to be any mistakes that unintended consequences. But we have approved it, and we've been the benefit of Alaska's and other states' use of those systems, and we think it'll be great in Texas.
And are these paraprofessionals authorized to appear in court?
They are, and there's a rule that says you can do this, you can't do this. There's a kind of a training process that is important, but it's not rigorous. And these are people who already know something of the legal practice and profession. But as she mentioned, unauthorized practice of law rules in the states do not let non-lawyers practice law. And so this is a way that they can do things which might be considered practicing law, but really are just providing help to legal aid providers and others.
Well, I was happy to lead a letter to the Appropriations Committee to seek funding for access to justice, something that we all support. 48 senators on a bipartisan basis have written, Senator Murphy and I, with leading that, and it's a rare occasion these days when you see 48 senators on a bipartisan basis agreeing to anything. So that part represents some success. But I wonder if you just take a moment, Chief Justice Hecht. I recall that there was a day when funding for the Legal Services Corporation was in jeopardy because of some of the, what I would call, politicalization of its caseload. And would you refresh my memory and maybe share with others, how did we deal with that in Texas to ensure that support for legal services remained bipartisan and was not overcome or overtaken by politics and thus jeopardizing the program?
I think just by explaining it, I've spent countless hours walking the halls of Congress, the House of Representatives, over the years with the American Bar Association representatives, talking to Texas legislators. But I remember I was sitting in one Congresswoman's office some years ago, and really after 10 or 15 minutes, she said, I just was not aware that I'd heard about it, but I was not aware that this was happening. In Texas, when the IOLTA program folded because interest rates crashed in 2008, 2000.
IOLTA is interest on lawyer trust accounts.
Right, and it's been a major funder of legal services since the early 80s, 1981. I think it's the first date. But I was sitting in a Senate committee room, Senate Finance Committee room in the Texas legislature when the chair, an oil man from East Texas, said, what are you going to do about the loss of IOLTA funding? And Chief Justice Jefferson and I said, we don't know. And he said, suppose we give you half of it. And first time I'd ever had a legislator offer me money. When I got up off the floor, I said, sure, we'd take that. But that was the beginning of funding. I mentioned putting a face on things when in about 6 sessions ago, I asked the legislature for access to justice, legal aid funding for veterans. They were falling all over themselves to try to help us out because it's just such an obviously worthy thing to do. So I think the more we do that to show that this is about good government, access to justice, denial of access to justice hurts taxpayers because they have to pick up the pieces of people's lives that are hurt. Business communities are for it because it helps employees and customers. And I think the more you do that, it just gets a good, strong bipartisan name.
Thank you very much, Senator Cornyn. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing and presiding. Again, thanks to our witnesses. I want to focus on veterans, Mr. Flagg. Is lack of representation for veterans a topic of particular concern?
It is. It's of particular concern, obviously, because one would think that people who have served our country, when they come back, deserve reciprocity. They deserve, if they've been promised, for example, veterans benefits, we ought to keep our promise in that regard. And all too often, our promise with regard to veterans benefits is not kept. As I'm sure you know, the veterans benefit and medical system is quite large. And all too often it does require help to navigate that system, and legal aid can be a source of help, and that is certainly a priority for many of the programs we fund. Also, all too many of our veterans find themselves homeless at this point in history and suffer the same issues that all of the people living in poverty face in terms of homelessness, mental health, and for all the same reasons that people living in poverty need help, veterans need help, and as I say, many of our programs prioritize that.
And one of the conditions suffered by veterans is very often post-traumatic stress, the kinds of traumatic injuries that can cause an individual to lack the basic skills of articulating and arguing and sometimes comprehending what the issues may be in a legal setting. In that instance, I would guess their needs are particularly urgent.
Exactly right. And often those injuries may have occurred years ago. They could be more recent, but our legal system, again, sort of built with rules and on the assumption that people will have help, require a showing of, when did the incident happen, showing a tie between the incident and physical injury. Those are not things that lay people, even those who haven't suffered a traumatic incident, are good at proving or good at establishing. That's where the assistance of a lawyer or somebody else trained in those procedures are indispensable.
We're very fortunate in Connecticut to have some excellent non-government and non-legal services corporation resources, such as the Veterans Clinic at the Yale Law School and our Connecticut Veterans Service Clinic, but there still is that gap for veterans in Connecticut, and my guess is elsewhere in the country as well.
Yes, absolutely. And those programs you mentioned are terrific. I chaired the National Veterans Legal Services Program Board for over 15 years, and we partnered with those programs in Connecticut, and they're really our leaders. And the sad fact is, whether it's Connecticut or the District of Columbia, where we have many programs, even with those programs, even with that focus, the justice gap is immense.
There is a school of thought, I've heard it argued, that the solution is more arbitration, forced arbitration, that involves no lawyers. I happen to think that forced arbitration and arbitration in general, no substitute for our justice process. Can you give me your views on that?
Sure. So, first of all, I would say this is not a one-size-fits-all problem. I think Chief Justice Hecht alluded to potential dispute resolution systems that could be facilitated by AI online, and if you had a simple commercial dispute where both parties were reasonably facile in dealing with the technology and could present their sides of the case equally, then that might be a possibility. But again, whether you're talking about a domestic relations case, a custody case, a veterans benefit case, invariably there are proof, there are rules that need to be followed, and whether it's a lawyer or somebody who has been trained in helping people resolve those sorts of problems, additional help will often be necessary, whether it's in the context of an arbitration or some court facilitated dispute resolution model. So I don't think arbitrations in and of themselves are going to eliminate the justice gap.
I appreciate your responses. I'm out of time, so I apologize. I can't explore these issues, but maybe I'll just turn to Chief Justice Hecht if you have any more comments on either mediation or arbitration as means to address this issue.
Yes, and I agree with Ron that this is a very complex problem. So with regard to what Senator Tillis said earlier, the adversary system is not well designed to help in eviction cases because it pits people against each other, and landlords and tenants already don't like each other. So this just makes it worse. If it's, two big insurance companies fighting against each other, well, that's fine. It probably helps get to the truth. But with a lot of disputes, particularly in the legal aid area, it's much more effective to mediate it, arbitrate it, to try to get the people together on some inexpensive, quick solution that's fair. I mean, we don't want to give up fairness just to make it quick. But it has a place. And, a lot of the criticism of arbitration is when you're forced to do it, when you feel like you're taken advantage of because it's in a consumer contract or something. There are lots of reasons when it does not appear to have the benefits that it does in legal aid cases.
Thank you. Thank you all again for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. And Senator Blumenthal, you and I both know Mike Wishney well and the leadership of the folks at the Yale Veterans Clinic and admire their work. Delaware Law School also has a veterans legal clinic. So many states rely on law clinics at law schools. That's how I was introduced to landlord-tenant. But, frankly, the whole point of this hearing is that they cannot meet the need. The tremendous work of pro bono lawyers, the tremendous work of legal aid attorneys does not meet the need for millions of Americans. Ms. Nelson, I hope folks who listen will take away that really painful sentence you delivered to us, which is that those who dedicate their lives to being legal aid attorneys end up having to ration justice. A dear friend of mine, Chris White, a real role model of mine of blessed memory, was the head of Delaware Community Legal Aid. And one of the hardest things for him was knowing that he had to turn away half of those who came to Delaware Legal Aid seeking representation. We have a very good bench and bar. We're very engaged in trying to deliver justice, but we are, as you said, Mr. Chief Justice, welshing on the commitment to the American people of access to justice. Ms. Gonzalez, your testimony today was in some ways the most powerful because it was the most personal about how domestic violence victims don't get the representation they deserve and that they need. Just tell me for a moment, if you could, you walked us through the very scary, very difficult process of fighting for your freedom, for your child to get out of an abusive situation. On some level, you got lucky. You got representation, first by a law student through a clinic, but then an attorney. And through that whole process of fighting for custody and fighting for child support, how important was it for you to have an attorney who was fighting for you and in whom you had confidence? And how important is it for you that others get access to justice as you did? Is that why you're on the board of legal aid, and is that why you're still active in this field?
Yes. At the beginning, when everything was going on, I remember it was a span of 3 days. September 14 was the day I had left my abuser. September 15 was the day I came home to Chicago. And then September 16 was the day I went to 555 West Harrison Street to get my order of protection.
I know you remember the exact
Yeah.
dates and addresses because this was so important for you.
It was very touching for the simple fact that a lot of organizations did not want to take my case because of how complex it was. But thankfully, Legal Aid Chicago took it and were able to really fight for it, because at that time they were calling it the impossible case. They were calling it the Washington case because it was very little cases where two states are fighting jurisdiction for a child, not just for me. And thankfully, because I was not married, it was easier for me to get the services transferred to Illinois. And it's so important because I have met a lot of women during therapy sessions, counseling sessions, how they suffer too from domestic violence, abusive relationships. Even mental abuse is one of the hardest abuse out there. And it really touched me on a personal level to see so many women struggle and fear their abusers, because we should not live in the fear of men or anybody. If anything, I encourage women to find legal services. I always direct them to Legal Aid Chicago because that's where I got my help, and I was forever thankful. And for me, it's just so important to really get domestic violence known and out there because it's very common, unfortunately. And
Far too common.
very personal, but my mom too was a domestic violence survivor. Though my mom did not get resources, she was able to leave her abuser as well. And she met my father, which they ended up having 3 beautiful more children, me being the first, of course. But yes, it's so important that other women seek help, and a lot of them cannot afford private attorneys. If anything, I was told that I should pay my abuser's attorney's fees because he had to go out of his way to get represented. And thankfully, that was thrown out.
Thrown out.
Yes.
And how important was it for you to keep at it, to not give up, to not go back, to not abandon? I mean, this is a hard thing to stay through. There's lots of messages that say, you're not going to win, you're not going to make it. How important was having a lawyer or an organization like Legal Aid that you trusted was fighting for you?
It was very important because there's moments where I wanted to give up and feeling that I had nothing to win. But thankfully, they were able to really force that I had a case that was winnable. It was doable. And they were not going to give up until we won this case. And because of the evidence that I got with my clinic in the state of Washington, it was more easier for my case to be won that way. But the fact that Legal Aid Chicago did not give up on me, they always made me think positive about my case, is what really helped me the most. And the face of my child at that time was really my motivation to continue on, go to school, and show him that life does not end when we go through hard times like this. If anything, he was my motivation to prove that after something that bad, there's something so beautiful in the end of the road. And that's why I encourage a lot of women in my shoes to not give up and continue going forward and express how lucky they are to be alive and to be able to show that they are worth more than what abusers make us feel. And that's why it's important to me, the representations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I doubt you know, but I'll share with you briefly how much struggles like yours, the courage that you've shown, your determination to fight for your children, for your future, for getting away from an abuser and getting into the life you deserve, how much that motivates folks around the country. I have interns this summer, interns here who want to go to law school. I want them to all watch your testimony. It was really only because of the legal clinic representing mothers with children facing homelessness in law school. That's the only reason I stayed in law school. The classes were horrible and boring. But I found the clinic riveting, and I found the fight to help support. Almost overwhelmingly, my clients were single moms with children facing homelessness, and to fight for them in court as a law student in my very first semester under Steve Weisner was a remarkable experience. And so thank you for your testimony today. Ms. Nelson, I suspect you were similarly motivated to go into a career in legal services by early experiences in which you saw both the huge civil justice gap and the power that a competent advocate can have in court. You're here today testifying to us about an innovative system or solution in Alaska, and you mentioned several other states that with LSC grants are trialing this. Tell me, if you could, what more could we do here as policymakers? I didn't end up being a legal aid attorney for my life, but I have ended up being a senator, and today chairing a hearing in the Judiciary Committee. And I have to say, my predecessor in this seat, our now president, is someone who was hugely passionate in his service here on Judiciary Committee about access to justice. What is it that we on a bipartisan basis could do to help accelerate the model you're innovating in Alaska?
Great. Thank you so much for the question, Senator Coons. I think there are a couple of things that I believe could be done in this case. One is to talk about the unevenness of unauthorized practice of law prohibitions and how those are imperiling people's access to justice, and how we might be able to change those laws such that more people could get the help that they need to address the civil justice crisis. And I also, would be remiss if I didn't make this point, that justice workers exist as a complement to legal aid organizations and a part of that. So again, the Alaska model would not have existed without robust funding for the Legal Services Corporation. And so again, justice workers, I think some piece of that can be the legal aid system can be repurposed and used to help support justice workers throughout the nation, where we can help people get access to trusted community resources out of that. So that's one area. And also I should mention that we were really grateful to the Department of Justice's Access to Justice Office, who has helped to highlight this model and to provide other federal resources that are available to support this work outside of those areas. Those would be the three things that I would.
And I think, as I said in my opening, the Qualified Advocate Program that we're now demonstrating in Delaware is another example. I thought your most compelling metaphor was the medical system, where, at least in Delaware, it's volunteer fire companies that do the overwhelming majority of ambulance response, and then county-trained paramedics who are paramedics and medical professionals. But if we said that you could only provide health care through doctors, and there couldn't be EMTs, and there couldn't be volunteer firefighters, and there couldn't be nurses or nurse practitioners, and there couldn't be, we would be taking out 3/4 of who provides health care in this country. And in particularly in emergency situations, where what matters is getting to the courthouse, getting a protective order, and making progress. If you could, Mr. Chief Justice, you may have heard me speak about this bill, Driving for Opportunity, that I'm passionate about. I just wanted to briefly say, can you speak about how the practice of revoking a driver's license simply to enforce the payment of fines and fees can produce a debt trap, and how that exacerbates civil legal needs?
Well, it certainly does. In my 2017 State of the Judiciary address to the Texas legislature, I pointed out that it just makes no sense. And at the time, we had a virtually automatic suspension of driver's license if you couldn't pay the fee. Now, I sort of tongue-in-cheek suggested that if you revoke the hunting license, that might really get people's attention in Texas. But driver's license makes no sense. So in 2019, the Texas system was changed and does not have that automatic revocation anymore. And then the Conference of Chief Justices that I mentioned, we put out a study on fines, fees, and bail reform back in 2016 or 17, and called for judges not to impose automatic revocations because of the reason you exactly said. If they can't pay their fine, why would you keep them from going to work? It makes no sense.
It's also something law enforcement's been very clear about. They'd like to stop doing traffic stops simply as debt collectors.
Right.
Because of the risk and the imposition. And those who care about poverty and inequality and access to justice see this as unkind. So I am hoping to persuade our joint dear friend to join me as a co-sponsor. I'd be interested, if I could, in my remaining few seconds, Senator Wells, to hear from you, Mr. Flagg, and the Chief Justice as well, about how you think artificial intelligence and remote training. And the pandemic forced all of us to reimagine courts, lawyers, and legal practice in a time when Zoom arraignments and Zoom depositions and so forth in Delaware, not widely acceptable, were considered. And for vast states like Alaska, delivering legal resources to remote places, vast states like Texas, Delaware, okay, no one ever describes as vast. But this is a vast nation, and we have millions and millions of people unable to get access to the legal services they deserve. Please, if you would, Mr. Flagg, and then if you would close by an additional comment, Mr. Chief Justice. What are the tools we could be deploying, and what should we as policymakers be facilitating?
Well, let me give you an example, and let me say that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of this topic in practice. And when we look back on this moment 5 years from now, we're going to say, gee, we had no idea that was going to happen. But with that caveat, I would say, imagine something like TurboTax. Imagine that somebody can go online and describe themselves. Obviously, they have to be able to, one, get online. They may have to go to a library. They may need help getting online, but provide information about their legal problem, whether it's an eviction or a domestic situation, and be provided with information that's responsive directly to the information they've provided about the resources that might be available, or even more helpfully, help in filling out a form that could be filed in court. So those are the sorts of tools that I believe are in reach shortly. And again, one size is not going to fit all. AI is not going to be the answer for every legal problem, but it's going to be, I believe, a big help to legal aid programs, other providers of services for people who need help in the legal arena. And I think I'm looking forward to the next 5 years' development in that regard.
I look forward to hearing more from you about that as it moves forward. Mr. Chief Justice, you get the last word of my round, and then I will defer to my...
Yeah, we know so little about AI, at least in the legal community. We're not technologically astute by reputation. But one thing AI does well is summarize. So AI could take a transcript of this meeting and give you whatever you ask for, 1 page, 2 page summary of what every person said, which is commonly used now in businesses. And it doesn't, it's not like a brief where you're thinking up arguments to make and looking for authority. It's just telling you this is basically what happened. So you could use that for depositions. You could use it for client interviews. You could use it in presentations to clients. There's all kinds of ways that it can simplify the communication. What it will do in the future with respect to, look, this is what you need, here's where you go to get it, we're still waiting to see. The business community's way ahead of us on some of these things. But we can't help but think, just like IT has made such a huge difference in letting people communicate. Zoom's not AI, Zoom's just a camera. But it has revolutionized domestic relations cases in the United States. People actually show up because they don't have to take off work and go to the hearing. So I'm expecting, and we're actively trying to see what it will do. So I know my court, I know the U.S. Fifth Circuit is exploring internally how can we use AI, again, not to write opinions, not to generate legal decisions, but just to present information to the people that are. And I think just continuing to give the LSC the resources they need, the encouragement, and I said in my written testimony, so few people really know that this is a problem. So we're sitting here, and the only reason we're here because we know it's a terrible problem. But a lot of the public does not, and so the more we can encourage businesses, the medical profession, other professionals to support access to justice, the better we are.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and thank you to my colleague, Senator Welch, for your patience. Senator Welch?
Thank you, Senator Coons. I really appreciate it. And, you know, your bill is, I think, the best argument or best example of why we have to have good funding for legal services. You know, so much of what happens to people who are poor is completely invisible. And others who don't get caught up in that web have no clue. So you have somebody who can't pay a fine. You know, I was a public defender, worked legal aid for a little bit, and they get their license suspended. Next thing you know, they're picked up for on a way to work and charged with driving with a suspended license. They get another fine, and you're just doomed. And they can't get out of it because they don't have money to begin with. And these practices are invisible to the rest of the world, and in many cases, the rest of the bar. And it's really wonderful that, you know, somebody who worked at a small law firm, Sidley Austin, understands that. And a Chief Justice, you know, that's amazing because you've got credibility. And then to have a client, a legal aid, and then a legal aid director, it's really inspiring to me to see the commitment that all of you have to trying to shine a light on the dilemma that we've created, the trap that we've created. So all this is to say we really need a budget to help folks. You know, in Vermont, one of the we're like everywhere. We've got a wicked housing crisis now, and for folks living that are poor, it's always rent, and there may be they may be paying their rent, but there may be some device that a landlord can use to get them out because they might be able to evict that person and get higher rent. But those folks have rights, and our legal aid folks are doing a great job just making certain that these folks get their rights. So I'll just ask. Mr. Flagg, I do appreciate your long service. Just describe why it is so important that we have adequate funding, substantial funding really, for legal services for lower income folks around the country.
I would actually go back to what I said during my opening statement, which is that as Justice Scalia noted 10 years ago, equal access to justice is fundamental to our country. It's fundamental to our democracy. And if, as you said, if a segment of the country is not served by the justice system, nobody is well served by the justice system. Justice for a few is not justice for all. And in addition to the justice gap, we have, as you've described, a knowledge gap. Few people outside of this hearing room, relatively few people in the country are aware of this terrible problem. The fines and fees problem you described is a horrible trap. You know, there probably are, you know, fewer than 30,000 people in the country who are aware of that trap.
Right. Well, thank you, and thank you for your work. And Ms. Gonzalez, you know, a client, it made a difference in your life. You had a lot of things you had to contend with that are really, really hard, and God bless you for for doing that. We all admire you. But just tell us what it meant to you to have access to a lawyer from legal aid.
Yes. So another thing that I was remembering how hard it was to represent myself if I had to, because the stuff that Legal Aid Chicago were doing, I didn't even know, probably 95% of it, I did not know I needed to do. And I strongly feel like without their help, I would have had to return to Washington, where my abuser was, and had no support over there, and I probably would have lost the custody of my child, which is why I feel it's very important to get legal help in any way or form, especially from a person that could not afford it, to now it's still very important to have that type of representation to be known.
Well, you know, that is so true. You know, I remember the first time I went into court. I went to law school and showed up in court, and I was like bewildered. And then I'm thinking about you with not even, you know, not even having to pretend you knew what you were doing. It really mattered to you. So thank you for hanging in there. Chief Justice, it's so wonderful to have, a person in your position taken so seriously the absolute necessity of having legal services for people. So I just want to pay my respect for that. Vermont, we'd fight hard for a hunting license too, so we get that. But just, it is invisible, and you're doing this, in your capacity, and you've got a prestigious position from which to do it. But it's hard to be poor. It's a lot of work. It's not just, there's a lot of situations that make your life very difficult. It's not just that you're, quote, not working or don't want to get ahead. You do. And that debt trap that you're talking about is one of them that is absolutely unfair and unnecessary. So I just want you to reiterate your view about why we have to have a substantial budget for legal services.
Thank you, Senator. And the debt trap is a problem, but I think one of the hardest things about it is it's also stupid, because when we gave judges the discretion not to revoke driver's licenses and to waive part of the fee, collections went up. The system produced more revenue because somebody who said, I can't pay $400 in fines and fees. Well, can you pay $150 and just don't do it again and don't come back here? Oh yeah, I could do that. And so, you're saving $100 a day by not putting somebody in jail. You're actually collecting some money. It's humanitarian. It's easier on the taxpayers. It's just everything. You wonder why you ever went that way at all. But the same thing is true, I think, with access to justice. Chief Justice Reiber in Vermont has worked very hard on mental health issues in cases, again, in the legal system, and especially with the poor. And it just makes no sense to punish somebody who doesn't understand what's happening to them and why. And so I think the more that we work on those issues, we come up with a system that is fair to more, and people will come back and step back and say, well, I hope they'll say, thank God for the courts. We're ways from that, but that we'll see the justice system as really being just.
Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Welch. The brutal reality is that literally millions and millions of Americans every year are denied access to justice simply because we fail to fund a justice system that is just. Senator Butler.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I apologize for my tardiness. I have no doubt that my colleagues have given a rigorous examination of your experiences, as well as taking some learned lessons from the incredible work that you all are doing. Mr. Chairman, I think your last note was one that I'd like to just start with. Can we actually call it justice if it is unequal? And the work that all of you do, the commitment and fortitude that you have shown to continue to push our country to achieve its promise of equal justice on behalf of everyone is truly to be commendable, and the lessons that you give us all in terms of how we must do better to do that is of great import. I rushed over from the Chair Powell in the Banking Committee to make sure that I was able to be here to recognize this incredibly important work, particularly the work that you all do in California. The Legal Services Corporation has 11 different offices across my state, with nearly 65% of the clients being women and 57,000 of their clients being children. 50% of all Legal Services Corporation grantees involve housing. And so I left my questioning with Chairman Powell because I wanted to put on record the incredible importance of the work that is being done to advance the promise of equal justice, acknowledging that we are not there yet. But being incredibly proud to be from a state where we are doing our best to get there faster. And so thank you all, and Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank you, Senator Butler. Thank you, Senator Welch. We've had great participation in this hearing today from across the committee, bipartisan support, and I'm grateful to this strong group of witnesses. You have outlined for us in stark detail what should be known to all and what is experienced day in and day out by millions of Americans, which is whether it's a landlord-tenant case, a veterans case, a public benefits access case, a consumer rights case, or domestic violence case. We are demonstrably failing to deliver justice in this country. And people of goodwill who have significant positions in our bench and bar, in our Senate, and in other places in our societies need to take this issue seriously. It is striking this is the first full committee hearing on this topic in 15 years. It is also striking Senator Cornyn and Senator Murphy led a bipartisan letter to increase the investment in the Legal Services Corporation and access to justice. Ms. Nelson, thank you for sharing some innovative solutions in the state of Alaska. And again, Ms. Gonzalez, thank you so much, not just for your personal testimony, but also for your engagement in Legal Aid Chicago, and you're continuing to make sure that others who need and deserve access to justice are getting it. With that, questions for the record may be submitted by senators who did not attend or who have questions up till 5 p.m. on next Tuesday, July 16th. I want to thank our witnesses again and all the members who participated. This hearing is hereby adjourned.